were just fascinated with the whole idea of exploring our own lives and figuring out what was going on, what was wrong. So there were a lot of us who were in the midst of trying to deal with birth control and abortion and all those reproductive rights issues. And there were another whole group of us who were having babies or just had babies or were about to have babies or about to have a second baby, whatever. So that was a very relevant issue. There's lots of room in the front. The words you always love to hear. And then as we went around the room, it just seemed like everybody in the room had a story about some way that the medical profession was not responsive to what we wanted to know about our bodies, and that we didn't even always know what questions we should be asking. And by the end of that workshop, that's an hour and a half, a couple of hours, whatever it was, most of us were convinced that we had to continue working on this issue, talking together. And so we set a meeting, which is the first line of the history of many, many organizations during this period. So the first thing that this group did was they said, there have to be some good doctors. Let's make a list of them. And they put little ads in various movement newspapers in Boston, and in the Boston Women's Newsletter, which went to about 1,000 houses a month, that said, here, call this number, we'll send you a questionnaire and fill it out. And the questionnaire said, who's your doctor? Has this doctor been respectful to you? What has your experience been? And they figured that a clear pattern would emerge. Most of these women were living in a few neighborhoods in the Boston area, and they could make secure recommendations. That did not happen, did not even come close to happening. Instead, they get 4 or 5 recommendations and we say, Dr. So-and-so, what a prince among men. Can't say enough good about him. Love, love, love him. And then the next letter that would come in, same doctor. What a jerk. Cannot stand him. Totally sexist. Warn all women to avoid him. And so they figured this is just not the way to proceed. And instead what we have to do is we have to learn what we need to know so that we can manage our own relationships with our physicians. And so that we can, understand what's going on when we go for that visit. That initial choice tells us a lot about what healthcare was like in 1969. Medical care was something that you individually negotiated with your physician. It was a dyadic relationship, patient-physician, in which the physician really had all the cards that there were to be dealt, and all of the power. Particularly in Massachusetts in 1969, if you were an unmarried woman, and you wanted a prescription for birth control pills or for a birth control device, you had to talk to a doctor who was willing to find a way to prescribe that birth control material to you under the sort of restrictive exceptions to the Massachusetts law that said you could not prescribe birth control for unmarried women, which meant that you were very dependent on that physician who could withdraw the prescription at any time or change his mind. Also, medicine was a much less mediated and technological process. The number of medical tests that people were used to going through was many fewer, and the number of medical procedures that people went through was also much smaller. Things that we take for granted as routine preventative health care, like mammograms and pap smears, these were not especially common. Some people did them, many people didn't. So when you're talking about medical care in 1969, you're basically talking about, I feel sick, I go to see my doctor. I need something medical, I go to see my doctor. And so figuring out how to handle that conversation is really figuring out how you're going to get your medical care. So the group started to talk about their experiences in their body and their experiences at various junctures of the female reproductive life cycle, which was really what they were interested in at that time, because that was what was in front of them. They talked about first menstruation, first sexual experiences. They talked about sexuality a lot. They talked about birth control, about what were then called sexually transmitted diseases. No, they weren't called sexually transmitted diseases. They're venereal diseases, because, and then there was this dim shadow far on the horizon of menopause that they sometimes wondered about, but weren't going to really research too effectively. So they decided they would take their education, what they called their body education, into their own hands. They made up a list of topics that were basically organized around the reproductive life cycle of women. They divided them up. I'll take this one, you take that one. And they parted company for the summer, because many of them were still students. During the summer, they researched these topics, and it's very interesting how they researched them. Medical libraries are not always just open to anyone. Some are, some aren't to this day. And in Boston at the time, the Boston University Medical Library, which was a subway ride away from where most of these people were living, totally open, you could walk into it. But the Harvard Medical Library, the Countway Library, you had to be not just a Harvard student, you had to be a Harvard medical student. Okay? That all used the Countway Library, which meant they had to sneak in. And one of their members, Lucy Candiv, who only worked on the first 2 editions, was a medical student, so they all borrowed her library card and sneaked in. And I mean, this is crazy, because they could just walk into something 20 minutes away. But I think it expresses the way that they felt that they were doing something forbidden, that this was knowledge that they had to almost steal under the noses of sort of the people who were controlling it and restricting it. They also looked at documents that they themselves had produced. They looked at their old diaries, they looked at letters, they looked at journals that they had kept during sort of critical moments of their life, during moments of pregnancy and childbirth. And then they wrote up reports, just like people would do, you know, in a seminar or a classroom. Here's my report on, you know, the clitoral orgasm. And they gave these papers, talked through these papers in weekly meetings of the collective. Very soon, I have asked every member of the collective, do you have any of those papers? Because that would be like a gold mine. And no, they didn't, and they didn't even particularly consider them important. What they considered very important were the conversations that happened afterward. And somebody would say, no, it wasn't like that for me, or it was like that for me at this time, but not that time, or I've heard sometimes it can be. And a lot of these conversations were criticisms or alternatives to current medical practice. Current medical practice held that nobody could really stand childbirth if they were fully conscious. And people said, no, actually I've heard, or perhaps it could happen that. And the idea of alternatives began to develop in those conversations. Through those conversations, people began to sort of realize that they were learning a boatload about medicine, about their bodies, about their experience, and that both of the sources they were learning from were important. Their research into the forbidden knowledge of the Countway, and their research into the equally forbidden knowledge that happens when women get together and talk very, very frankly and in an atmosphere of trust about how things have been for them. They decided to share this knowledge. And so they offered a course called Women and Their Bodies. Women and Their Bodies was offered at MIT. A fair number of the people who were central to the collective had connections with MIT. And it was a giant, huge course. 50 to 100 women came. It's held in a lounge. It's held in Boston in the middle of winter, and from what I can tell, the winter of 1969, 1970 was a hideous, hideous winter. I mean, people talk about how much they love the course, but they also talk about like how they risk their life to get to these sessions. And here's an account of the session on masturbation. And it's by Jane Pincus, an important member of the collective. Although if she heard me say she was an important member of the collective, she would like beat me around the head and say, no, 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 we were all important. She was still important. 50 women. Tremendous feeling of sexuality, freedom, and excitement. A lot of women, for the first time, talked about themselves, their experiences, how they felt. People just had a sense that we could learn about ourselves, and that what we learned would give us a lot of control, a lot of power. And that seems to have been the emotional experience that many, many of the participants in these events had. Women who, these classes, and I mean there weren't classes in any normal sense, started with the same kind of revised papers that the group had produced over the summer. And women who'd gone to the classes saw that there were these papers, and they said, hey, can we have some of those? And so very quickly, the original group that had worked over the summer, and some new people who'd come in from the course, said, okay, let's put these papers together. And they did, and published the first edition of what would become Our Bodies, Ourselves. And I like this picture because of the incredible passion with which she's holding it. But that's the only thing I really like about it. It's kind of murky. You see it says, women and their bodies, still. And it's written by the Boston Women's Health Collective. It has this picture on the cover, which was on the cover of every single edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves until 2005. It was very cheaply done. It was printed on newsprint. The original price was 35 cents. Then when the publisher who was put it out, New England Free Press, made their basic initial investment back, they lowered the price to 25 cents because, like, why profit, you know, a whole dime on each issue when you could get it into the hands of many more women. This was a 193-page booklet. It started out with a chapter called Women in Medicine Under Capitalism. And then it contained basically the chapters based on the female reproductive life cycle. And it was reprinted, and it was first put out in 1971, and then, 1970, and then in 71, put out in a revised edition, which is now called Our Bodies, Ourselves, 4 words. Although now the title we're used to is Our Bodies, Ourselves, 3 words. And it's interesting that the collective, almost always all members of the collective have a story about, we used to say women in their bodies, then we owned our bodies and we decided to say our bodies ourselves. But when I asked them, when did you decide to say our bodies ourselves instead of our bodies ourselves? No, I mean, we know that that happened in 1973, but nobody knows how or why. But to me, it's almost as significant a difference as the difference between women and their bodies. This book sold 250,000 copies, and given that it was distributed by people who were sending it through the U.S. mail at parcel post rates, this is a miracle. They just could not keep up with the demand. The publisher was like calling out members of the collective and saying, we're going to staple a whole bunch of copies this weekend. Could some of you come over and help us with the stapling? And they really didn't want to be in the book production business. And they realized they had to get it out to more people. And publishers were knocking down their door. After a long series of negotiations, they decided to go with Simon & Schuster. And they wrote a contract which was a landmark contract. They have complete control, final say, over every word that appears in every book, every word that appears in every advertisement. They have huge influence over distribution. There is free distribution of the book to certain sort of venues, such as groups of women in prison. There is vastly reduced price distribution to women's groups and women's clinics. And this is all negotiated in a long and difficult and protracted set of painful negotiations over several months, and then a rush to get to press in 1973. Between 1970, and the book immediately goes onto the New York Times bestseller list. Between 1973 and 1976, 3.5 million copies of the book are sold. After that, new editions would follow regularly. The 8th edition was published in 2005, and a 9th edition is in the works. Translations and adaptations began to appear almost as soon as the book was published, and I'll show you some of them. This is the current Japanese version, It's funny, the notes on this point out that they had to change the kanji because some things that you used to express in Chinese characters you now don't. Actually, this is the first of the Japanese translations, was a very, very early 1973 translation and adaptation. And it was remarkable because the writers switched out all of the very many photographs in the book and switched in photographs of Asian women. Before that, they had just imported Our Bodies, Ourselves because lots and lots of Japanese people had reading knowledge of English. But they ran into a really strong censorship custom in Japan. In Japan, they're not at all disturbed by all sorts of images, except they really don't like people looking at images of pubic hair. And so what they do with imported documents that have pictures of pubic hair is they like snip out a little triangle. So there were lots of copies of Our Bodies, Ourselves in English imported in Japan with little triangular cutouts out. So they decided better to use our own pictures, avoid that crazy cutout thing, and translate it. And they did. This is a newer adaptation. Here's the English adaptation. And, you know, at first it's kind of puzzling. Why would you do an English version of a book that's in English? Does anyone have any guesses? Punctuation? It doesn't have to do with punctuation or the spelling of labor. Well, they held the copyright. Actually, Penguin holds the copyright in Britain, so they didn't get anything out of it. But think about the experience of going to a doctor in the US and going to the doctor in Britain. National Health Service in Britain means that it's a whole different experience, and they had to offer women guidance on how to negotiate the National Health Service. So that was the British edition. And this, this, I hope, maybe this, is the Egyptian edition in 1991. This is a really hard-fought and triumphant edition. The writers of the Egyptian edition were really worried that there would be religious opposition to elements of the book. And so they consulted with progressive imams who gave talks in major cities in Egypt about how, like, this was a useful resource and women should feel free to take advantage of it. And that seems to have headed off that kind of religious opposition. It had huge, huge distribution in Egypt. The book has also been taken up and adapted by Serbian women who put it out during the Balkan War, although they eliminated the chapter on nutrition because that just seemed mean because nobody had access to any nutritious food. It's been revised and adapted by Tibetan nuns who have long chapters about, you know, your hips may get really sore from sitting in meditation 6 hours, and here are some stretches that can help. Currently, there's a group of Israeli and Palestinian women working together to produce a version in Arabic for Palestinian women in Israel and Palestine. Today, there are 25 adaptations and derivations of Our Bodies, Ourselves, which is really a remarkable range, and it grows. Whenever I give this talk, I have to check, and I have to change the number, and it's always bigger. So this is a really good story, okay? This is a story of success. It's a happy story. There's a group of utterly ordinary women, although quite well-educated women by and large, and they take into their own hands the job of figuring out what they don't already know. They meet together, and they move from a kind of ignorance to a kind of knowledge, and then they take that knowledge and they disseminate it around the world. Their work changes the way that medicine is practiced in the United States. And on some levels, medicine became more responsive to women during the 80s and 90s. And not only is this a good story, it is really true. Our Bodies, Ourselves was a critical piece of the women's health movement and made huge strides in securing women's reproductive freedom. It changed forever the protocols for relationships between women and their doctors, and it taught millions of women to take charge of their own health. But what I want to look at this afternoon, what I look at in my book, is the specific kind of work that women in the collective did. That is, they wrote, which is not the obvious thing to do if you're interested in health, right? They wrote particularly a book. What did that work accomplish? What was left undone? What can we learn from it? And I'll leave the picture of the collective in 1973 up so they can sort of look benignly at us. All of these women, except for one who died of breast cancer in the late 80s, is still alive and still active in the writing of Our Bodies, Ourselves, although some people work full-time with the collective. This woman, Judy Norsigian, is the executive director, and she works in the office full-time. And Norma Swenson, who's retired, does a lot of work. Many of the others are kind of living in different parts of the country, although almost all of them live in the greater Boston area. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective produced a completely new kind of book, and they also invented a new way of writing a book. I mean, it is really hard to grasp this, but in 1969, you could not go to a bookstore and say, I want a guide to women's health. There just wasn't one. You could find some books that are about health and that were directed at women. For example, you could find a How to Keep Your Baby Healthy book, or Family Health for Mothers, or you might find, oh God, the worst of them all, the Marriage Manual, which would contain extremely sanitized sexual advice. There is no place that you could find health information about your own health problems. Okay. Whooping cough? Yes. Cystitis? Ask your doctor. The books that were available were almost always written by male doctors. And not surprisingly, their main advice was, do whatever your doctor tells you. For example, one of the most popular baby books, the Better Homes and Gardens baby book, with editions in 1943, 46, 51, and 63, bestseller every time it was published, gave the following advice to pregnant women about getting prenatal care. Okay. So you're pregnant, you should see a doctor. Here's why. Serious complications, which might have been avoided by early diagnosis, are a much greater drain upon your doctor's time and strength, and upon hospital and nursing resources, than routine examinations and a normal delivery. Yeah. I want a normal delivery, so it's so much better for my doctor. And that was it was not a strange thing to write. It was an entirely normal piece of medical advice directed to women. Our Bodies, Ourselves began as a guide to the female reproductive life cycle, but it rapidly took on the mission of providing as much comprehensive health information as we can fit between the covers of a book. It offered that information from a woman's point of view, but it was not at all squeamish. In the 1970 edition, written soon after Masters and Johnson had debunked the idea of the vaginal orgasm, all information on the clitoris appears in virtually identical phrasing in each of the first 4 chapters, because there was no real editing for continuity, and everybody thought that was an important thing to put in. A discussion of masturbation in almost any edition was graphic enough to get the book removed from many high school libraries. Nor did the book hesitate to criticize common medical practices. The chapters on childbirth advocated for less physician control of the birthing process and for establishing a climate of trust between in the capacities of the laboring woman. As dramatic as the information the book provided was its way of organizing that information. The collective generally would have a medical explanation, and sometimes it was a quite technical medical explanation. They really prided themselves on being able to understand and follow and represent the material that they were uncovering in medical textbooks. And then they would put little snippets of individual women's stories. Now, we're real used to the idea that medical writing, popular medical writing, would have little examples. So you go to, WebMD, and you get the little, account of this is what happens, and then maybe there'll be a click to an individual patient's story. But this was not at all a normal way to present medical information. It was assumed that there was scientific information, and then there was just talk. This was a remarkable way of saying both sources of information are important to us. The collective was still using the book in different ways to run health courses, and they ran about 80 during the 2 years between 1971 and 73 while they're producing the book. If in the health course a woman said something or had a story that seemed interesting to them, they would give that person an index card and say, could you write that down? And would you mind if we used it in the book? And then they'd take that card and bring it back to their office and drop it in the file folder for that topic, so that they had a really rich collection of individual narratives to use when it came time to write the book. The way that the sort of way that they turned that experience into written text was equally innovative. Especially during the first 2 editions, authorship, I'm having to go back to the mic so I can hear. Authorship was widely distributed among a very large group of women. Although writers were given credit for their initial work on drafts, all of the chapters were edited by many hands. Chapters were read at the weekly meetings of the collective, and the group made many suggestions for changes and sometimes said, actually, this person has a good idea what to do with this, pass it on to them. In the final stages of work, the collective would just announce to the community in general a rewrite party. And there would be a table and chapters, and you would pick up a chapter and mess with it, turn it into publishable prose and go over to another table where there were pictures and pick out the pictures, the photographs that you thought should go in that chapter. After 1973, they kind of calmed down and had a more controlled process. Now, for some members of the collective, this was kind of antsy or difficult at first, but almost everyone had a very, very positive feeling about the experience of writing in this extremely open way. People were not at all wedded to what they had produced. They felt that what came out of this process was much better than what anybody could do, and they felt freed from having to stand behind every single word they wrote. They knew that other hands would touch it. As the book grew, and especially as medicine became more complicated, so you couldn't just go to a library and read stuff, you had to get real medical advice. The collective relied on an extensive network of sources of information of all sorts. And sometimes that information was activist. In 1973, they wanted to include a chapter on lesbians. 1976. But all of the women in the collective at that time were heterosexual, so they went to a group of lesbians who wrote the chapter, which was called In America, which is how some people spelled America in those days. They call us dykes. And I've read the correspondence that was written to those women, and it is heartbreaking. It's sort of like, I live in Bismarck, North Dakota. Do you know any lesbians there? This is the very first thing I have ever read about women loving women. What else can I read? It was the first mass market distributed information that many women encountered about lesbianism. But also, people needed information, say, about infertility. And so the infertility chapter in 2005 is written by a group, an advocacy group of patients, and with consultation with a number of physicians. These relationships with collaborators had to be negotiated one by one and figured out, because the collective wanted advice, but they also wanted control over what they produced. Finally, Our Bodies, Ourselves was a way of forging connections among groups of women. Every member of the collective that I talked to used the word conversation to talk about the book. They saw the book as just an extension between covers of the conversation that they were having among themselves, which was a long, intimate, and intense conversation. And they saw the book as provoking that conversation among other women. The book was distributed free or at reduced cost to health classes and to women's clinics. And there were directions in the book, sort of like in the back of novels today, there's how to do this in your book club. In early editions of Our Bodies, Our Selves, there were questions that your consciousness raising group or your women's health group could ask about this material. But there were real limits to what a book could do, even this good a book. From 1973 until 1985, Our Bodies, Our Selves developed in tandem with and symbiotically with a flourishing women's health movement in the United States, a broad network of women-run clinics, birthing centers, and other health initiatives that offered an alternative to conventional medicine. The collective organized the first National Conference on Women's Health in 1975. They shared the profits from their book with this group. There's this moment in 1974 when the collective had $25,000 in profits. So they have a meeting. What do we do with $25,000? Which at that point was wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. And some people say, well, you know, we could invest it and save it for a rainy day. No. If we invest it, we're participating in the capitalist system. We cannot do that. We must distribute this money. And so they just gave this money away in $5,000 grants to local women's clinics and other health initiatives and projects. 2 years later, they're out of money. They can't pay themselves. They're thinking of closing offices. And so they decided that maybe sometimes holding a reserve fund was not a bad idea. They sent out every week a little packet of information. This is a sort of interesting form. It's kind of a pre-mediation of certain blog forms. What would happen is every single week, and there are 100 file boxes of these in the archive, they would pick out the 5 articles on women's health, or 10 articles on women's health that seemed most important. They would Xerox them 100 times, they'd put them in 100 envelopes, and they'd mail them out to 100 places. And so every week, 100 organizations would get an envelope that had the news of the week in a form that was timely and extremely cheap, although not easy. It was a very labor-intensive form. In the mid-1980s, many of the lovingly and painfully constructed institutions of the women's health movement collapsed. Conventional medicine had adopted some of the innovations of the movement, so you could have your baby in a birthing room in a hospital instead of a sterile labor and delivery suite. But that meant that many fewer women went to birthing centers. The funding of women's health clinics had been drawn from federal programs, such as the CEDAR program, that just were completely eliminated very soon after the Reagan administration began. And there were serious internal conflicts in these institutions. A lot of them had been founded by volunteers who were perfectly willing to work incredibly crazy hours for almost no money. But then as they became institutionalized, they had to bring in people who actually needed a living wage to do the job, and that created all kinds of conflict. There were conflict also between patients and care providers, between alternative and conventional medicine. And as the resources dwindled, those conflicts became sharper. One after another, the lights went out in these institutions. The collective could offer some help and some advice and maybe an emergency loan, but they were not the federal government. They could not sustain these groups. Contact with those groups meant that the collective was always in direct contact with people who are on the cutting edge of alternative health care for women. And after 1985, that doesn't happen so much. And something is missing from the text because of that change. Many of the conflicts that divided the institutions of women's health were race conflicts, and the collective experienced its own share of them. In the mid-1990s, African American staff women in the Our Bodies, Our Selves office brought an affirmative action suit against the collective. And the collective were terrifically open and willing to talk about anything, absolutely anything with me. The one part of their history that they're really uncomfortable is this part. I got kind of crazy defensive stories. More broadly, Our Bodies, Ourselves has been criticized for offering a white woman's view of healthcare. Readers are assumed to have access to medical resources, but to want a different relationship with them. The collective, in many ways, inherited this problem from the social movements of the 60s and 70s. After Stokely Carmichael said, all you white people leave SNCC, go back and organize your own communities, lots and lots of people thought that there was really no place for multiracial political organizations in the United States, which was a horrible mistake. And members of the collective also felt that way, and they didn't really directly work with African American women health activists. By the late 70s, they started to remedy this. The collective collaborated with the Combahee Collective, which was a really interesting group of African American women in Boston who invented the term identity politics, and Billy Avery, a very important African American health activist, has long been associated with Our Bodies, Ourselves. I promised you I'd be done in a half hour. Here it is, 45 minutes, because I started digressing, which I can easily do. So I'm going to, just be very schematic for these last 2 pages. And also, the collective never figured out what to do with corporate medical care. It still continued to operate on the model of you are negotiating your health care with your doctor. And very few of us exactly do that anymore. I mean, most of us don't see an individual doctor in a freestanding practice. Most of us see a doctor who is part of a group practice. It's often attached to the hospital. And way too many of us don't see any doctor regularly at all because we don't have access to that kind of health resource. Our Bodies, Ourselves never figured out how to make that transition fully. Now, this is no shame to say. They didn't figure out how to build a multiracial organization, and they didn't have a solution to the healthcare crisis of the late 20th century. These are 2 big, hairy, intractable problems. Instead, we could also look at the things that the collective did do. First of all, they constructed a really joyful and productive relationship to scientific knowledge. They figured out how to actually learn real science, to insist on their right to know real science, and to integrate that with their own experience in a really productive and original way. And given how many of the problems that we face, continuing problems in medical care, problems of climate change, problems of conservation, problems that have very technical, scientific issues at their heart, this model of how ordinary people can take on that knowledge and not make themselves miserable or immobile or depressed, but do something, that's a really, really helpful and interesting model. Second, it provides us a model of writing as a pleasure. And I'm speaking here as a person for whom writing is, teaching writing is an important part of what we do. And, we can't help but notice that for many students, the thought of writing a paper is not one that fills you all with joy. You don't say, oh boy, a paper. But for the collective, writing was a deep pleasure. They looked forward to it. One person, Nancy Holley, says, when something comes out of your lived experience, it's not seen as an activity like writing. It's just words and paper, just a vehicle to share your experience. And so this practice gives us a model that I think writing teachers can draw from of ways in which writing can become a source of pleasure. And then third, we could think of the way that the collective used the technologies of its day. Now, if you look at this page, which is certainly totally illegible to you, it does not look very fancy. But what the collective was doing here was drawing on what was then a new technology of photo offset printing. This material is written on a typewriter, okay? And notice that it's not justified because typewriters didn't justify it. So somebody just sat and typed it up. And typed it up probably on a page where the shape of the picture was drawn in pencil. And so you didn't type in that space. Very simple. Then the picture is added,
And new material, like the caption and the credit, is handwritten in with Black India ink. In the final stages, when you know exactly where this is going to go in the book, you add at the top the page number, also in Black India ink. Sometimes if you wanted to get fancy, there were these things called press-on type. They could do it like it's regular numbers and you press them down. It's very cool. And then, I mean, this is so, I mean, it's kind of labor intensive, but all the labor is easy. And it's also labor with the things that women were assumed to be good at and had to do a lot of. Typing, drawing, measuring. Then this material would all be pasted up on just a sheet of paper with rubber cement, and it would be sent through a machine, something like a Xerox, and it would produce a paper plate, a paper printing plate, which could then be used for photo offset printing. If you wanted to switch out the picture, you could do that immediately. Whereas in old hot type processes, you had to have a skilled person setting in the type. You had to send out the picture for engraving. The engraving took like 3, 4, 5 days, so you had to know what the picture was long before you went in. And the pagination had to be set too. So this was a very flexible set of technologies for that period, and they really made use of them. That allowed them to distribute this for 35 cents, and then after 100,000 copies, we've remade our paper investment. I mean, newsprint. Newsprint was like so cheap that it was like plastic bags are today, It was a ubiquitous substance. And that allowed them to develop distribution networks that nobody had seen or understood before. As we're sort of working through a period where people are using new technologies to do new kinds of writing, and a lot of those new kinds of writing are political in different ways. A lot of them are feminist. They're by and about women. And in that situation, oh my goodness, it's really helpful for us. I had a picture, but I won't be able to do that. It's really helpful for us, I think, to look at this model of how women use writing in a political way, and a different way of producing it, a different way of distributing it, to see what the possibilities of writing are. And maybe also some, people who are doing that kind of writing will need something to read, as generations of organizers have needed things to read. And you might take a look at some version of our bodies ourselves. It would be interesting. And then please, produce what you need for yourselves now, because it'll be wonderful to see that. So thank you very much.